Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok will sit down with U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in Washington next week for talks on tariffs at the invitation of the latter, according to the ministry here. With more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Press Perspective. It's Wednesday, April 16th here in capital Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. Now, South Korea's strategy in tackling U.S. tariffs is dialogue over dispute to draft a deal that will drive forth productive partnership. For more on this, I have Lee Ji-hoon, a correspondent for Reuters, here in the studio with me. Ji-hoon, it's a pleasure to have you back. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Ji-hoon, for the sake of clarity then, because tariffs have been on, tariffs have been off. So for the sake of clarity, what import items currently face U.S. tariffs?
So there have been tariffs announced on several products and many different countries so far by the Trump administration. It started with 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, which are still in effect. And there have also been tariffs on imports of cars and auto parts, which also are still in effect. And there have been tariffs on various countries, our trading partners, such as China, Mexico, Canada, and other exporting countries. With China, the U.S. started with 20-some% tariffs, but then with their retaliatory measures back and forth, they went up to 145% on imports from China and about 120-something% of in China for imports from the United States, which they say basically is like, which practically makes goods trade improbable for the two countries. For Mexico and Canada, which have a trade agreement with the United States, they are faced with 25% tariffs. And Trump administration also announced various tariffs on a number of countries with so-called reciprocal tariffs, but those are paused for 90 days, but they still face, every country faces a blanket 10% tariff right now.
Right. So at the moment, we have 145% tariffs for China, 25% for the U.S.'s biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada. And for the rest of the world, we have a baseline 10% tariff with regard to the country-specific tariffs, because the actual tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, have been paused for about 90 days. And steel and aluminium have a 25% tariff in place, and car imports to the U.S. face 25%, with car parts to face tariffs by the 3rd of May, right? Just to be clear.
Yes.
Right, okay. Ji-hoon, what's the latest with regard to now tariff exemptions? I understand we have exemptions on electronics and we have exemptions on cars. Could you specify what exactly are we looking at?
Yeah, so the customs agency in the United States announced that there will be tariff exemptions on electronic devices. And many analysts say that is because of Apple, because Apple heavily relies on China for its supply chain. So, that was also good news for South Korean electronic companies as well. But then Trump later said it's just a pause for now, but still there will be a reassessment of tariffs on electronic devices with upcoming tariffs on semiconductor imports. So it's still uncertain, but for now, electronic devices are exempted from tariffs. And on cars, Trump recently also hinted or suggested that there could be exemptions, but still it's also uncertain. So Yeah.
Right. So the exemptions on electronics, they are in place, but they're temporary in nature, and the potential exemptions for cars is not yet certain. He just hinted at the idea. Right. Ji-hoon, what have been some of the support measures now pledged by the Korean government in response to these tariffs?
This week and last week, South Korea announced various support packages for its auto and chip industries, which led South Korea's exports to the United States in recent years. Just to share some context, South Korea exports to the United States rose 10% to a record high last year. And that was pushed up by exports of automobiles, auto parts, and semiconductors, accounting for around 42% of the total. And as you know, President Trump, as we discussed, Trump already imposed 25% on tariffs on auto imports. So that tariff is expected to hit South Korea hard because last year, nearly half of South Korea's auto exports were shipped to the United States. That is why South Korea last week announced emergency measures to support the auto industry, including a policy financing support raised to 15 trillion won from 13 trillion won to help smaller auto parts makers prevent any liquidity troubles. And the support package also included tax cuts on auto purchases to 3.5% from 5%, and subsidies for electric vehicles to boost domestic demand. The government also said it will make efforts to negotiate with the United States for tariff exemptions and help domestic automakers expand export markets in the global south, where demand is rising. Right. And that's for the auto sector. And this week, the government also announced a new package for the chip industry. And just because last year South Korea's exports of semiconductors accounted for more than 20% of the total exports, with more than 30% shipped to China, which is in trade war with the Trump administration right now. In response, the government said it will raise the financial package to 33 trillion won from the previous 26 trillion won that was announced last year. And that includes an increase in chip policy loans to 20 trillion won from 17 trillion won to help companies make more investment amid growing competition.
Right, I see. And Ji-hoon, I understand that beyond borders, South Korea is also seeking to enhance its cooperation with countries in Asia. And there is talk about an agreement between Seoul and Hanoi. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah. So Vietnam has been considered as an alternative manufacturing base amid growing competition between China and the United States. Among South Korean companies, Samsung Electronics entered Vietnam in 1989 and has become the biggest foreign investor in Vietnam, with about 60% of Samsung smartphones manufactured in the country. And many other South Korean firms followed Samsung during Trump's first presidency, as the tensions between China and the United States escalated. And now about 10,000 South Korean firms are operating in Vietnam. As a result, Vietnam has become the third largest export market for South Korea after China and the United States. That's why when Trump announced reciprocal tariffs earlier this month and hit South Korea with 25% tariffs and Vietnam with 46% tariffs, there were concerns that the tariff on Vietnam will also hit South Korean companies operating in Vietnam, such as Samsung Electronics and LG Electronics. That's why earlier this week, South Korea's industry minister An Duk-keun traveled to Hanoi to meet his counterpart, where they discussed responses to U.S. tariffs. An said at the meeting that the South Korean government will continue to talk, have consultations with the United States as well as Vietnam to mitigate any impact on South Korean companies from U.S. tariffs. And they also discussed expanding bilateral trade between South Korea and Vietnam with the goal of raising trade to over $150 billion by 2030, and cooperation on various sectors such as clothing, textile, and energy. That meeting between An and his counterpart was later followed by another meeting between our Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol and his counterpart, where they also discussed responses to U.S. tariffs. At the same time, what's interesting is that China is also strengthening cooperation with Vietnam, with its President Xi Jinping earlier this week, about the same time, visiting Hanoi to sign various agreements on cooperation and calling for more stronger cooperation on trade and supply chains.
Right, indeed. Chinese President Xi Jinping is currently on a Southeast Asia tour involving, of course, the Vietnam, as you mentioned, Malaysia and Cambodia as well. You mentioned Trade Minister An Duk-keun, Ji-hoon. He is expected to fly to the U.S. for tariff talks next week. Now, he's spoken about South Korea leveraging or holding the shipbuilding card in its negotiations with the U.S. This was covered by Reuters, I believe, as well. Do tell us a bit more about this.
Yeah, so Industry Minister An is expected to visit the U.S. next week or so, and just today, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok also said he is also scheduled to meet his counterpart at the invitation of the U.S. next week. If we go back a little bit, the talks about negotiation happened fast after President Trump and our South Korean acting President Han Duck-soo had a phone call last week, which Trump said was a great call, as they discussed various cooperation on areas of energy, LNG purchases, Alaska project, shipbuilding, and defense costs. Among those topics, on Alaska project, South Korea's industry ministry said yesterday that it could be part of the negotiation package, but it's not finalized yet, and it's still being discussed. And on defense cost, South Korea's finance minister said yesterday it was not for negotiation, at least for now. But when it comes to shipbuilding, South Korea's industry minister said it is a very important card for negotiation with the U.S. And his comments make sense because if we look back when Trump won the election last November, just the day after that, Trump had a phone call with former President Yoon Suk-yeol, where he specifically asked for cooperation on the shipbuilding sector. That is because South Korea is a major player in the global shipbuilding market, whereas there are growing concerns that the U.S. has fallen behind its rivals. The market is also overwhelmed or dominated by China, which makes South Korea and U.S. key allies like South Korea a valuable partner for the United States. There already is some kind of cooperation going on between the U.S. and Korea. with Hanoi Engine last year acquiring a shipyard in Philadelphia, and U.S. Navy commander last month or recently visiting a South Korean shipbuilding company to discuss maintenance projects. Officials here in Seoul say United States has shown a great interest in South Korea's shipbuilding sector. So they are trying to use the card or leverage it for negotiations with the United States.
Right, I see. So prospects are looking quite bright in that particular arena then. Ji-hoon, pundits here in the country earlier believe that the Bank of Korea may cut rates faster and deeper amid growing tensions over global trade in light of U.S. tariffs. But I understand there has been a slight change in those thoughts. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yep, the Bank of Korea is scheduled to hold its next policy meeting tomorrow after cutting interest rates by 25 basis points at its last meeting in February to 2.75%. In our recent survey, nearly 2/3 of economists, or 24 out of 37 economists, said the Bank of Korea will likely hold interest rates steady this time, while the rest expected the Bank of Korea to deliver a back-to-back rate cut. Back in February, the Bank of Korea said there will be more rate cuts this year, citing high downward pressure on economic growth from U.S. tariffs, with its GDP forecast for this year lowered to 1.5% from 1.9%. But then these days, the volatility in the local won currency heightened a lot due to U.S. tariffs shaking global financial markets. So many economists say the central bank is likely to take a wait-and-see stance this time to assess the impact of U.S. tariffs, which are weighing not only on South Korea's growth, but also on the local currency. That is putting pressure or putting the Bank of Korea in really tough position, because to support economic growth, of course, more rate cuts are necessary. But then, if the won weakens further due to rate cuts, then they will reignite inflation pressure as well. Still, so many economists expect the Bank of Korea will stay on hold this time, but still, the Bank of Korea's rate cutting cycle, which started last October, will continue this year, with the next rate cut most likely in May. And also there are growing expectations that the Bank of Korea's rate cutting cycle could be accelerated and become deeper due to the mounting impact from U.S. tariffs. For example, Citi expects that the Bank of Korea will lower interest rates by a total of 6 times to 1.25% by the end of next year. One BOK official recently said that they are reassessing the impact of U.S. tariffs on domestic economy, which is a signal that there will be more downgrades in its GDP forecast, which stands at 1.5% right now. So tomorrow at the Bank of Korea's meeting, many investors, traders, or analysts expect the main focus will be on the domestic impact of U.S. tariffs and how Governor Lee Chang-yong assesses it.
Right, I see. So all eyes will be on the Bank of Korea tomorrow then. Meanwhile, Ji-hoon, back in the U.S., experts are talking about greater risks of a recession in light of Mr. Trump's tariffs. What more can you tell us about that?
Yes, so many investment banks have been raising worries about tariffs triggering a recession in the United States, because Trump's tariff rate tariffs announcement brought U.S. tariff rates to like highest in decades, if not centuries. So there are worries. And of course, the worries about economic slowdown for granted and even recession, there are growing worries about that. That's why recently financial markets reacted really sharply to U.S. recession worries. So, and last week when South Korea's Kospi hit the lowest in more than 70 months, it was not just about worries that tariffs will hit South Korea's exports. It was more about U.S. tariff weighing on the U.S. economy itself. So there are still worries and evaluations, but of course uncertainty is really high. So we'll have to see how it develops and how economists reassess the economic outlook. Another thing is that the tariffs will, of course, raise inflation pressure in the United States. But interestingly, the central bank officials in the United States so far said this tariff shock could be transient or temporary, so they are not in a hurry to calm the markets or respond to U.S. tariff Trump's tariff measures. And they are also taking a wait-and-see stance in the United States. So monetary policy in the United States as well as in Korea, their uncertainty is very high over those.
Right, of course. Uncertainty appears to be the key word these days in light of Mr. Trump's tariffs. Anyway, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Ji-hoon, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Now, we return same time tomorrow with a look at the diplomatic impact of trade tensions between the U.S. and China. Join us then.